Are old games really better, or is it just nostalgia? That's a question that really needs to be tackled. And we can start doing that by first breaking down the question itself. First and foremost, what are old games? Now this depends a lot on when you yourself started playing games. On what were the first ones that you really remember, the ones that absolutely stuck with you for years and years. And then we have to wonder, what exactly do you mean by better? Better in what way? Better as a game in general, with better gameplay, better with pacing, better with, innovation, better graphics, and lastly, better than what? Exactly to what other games are you comparing the old one? Only when all these issues are resolved can you start answering the question if old games are really better or if it's just us remembering them as being better. So in this show I'm going to try and do my best to give you some examples and hopefully come to a conclusion. I'm going to start with one of the first games, probably the first game that I ever played. It's a game that I love, it's a game that I enjoy, a game that I have very fond memories of, and it's a game that's not good. That game is Bad Dudes vs. Dragonninja. I first played it in the arcade many years ago, and then a lot on the Terminator console, which was very popular in Eastern Europe, and is a clone of the NES, only delayed by about a decade. It was also dirt cheap, though not compared to our income, but still dirt cheap comparable to what an NES would have actually cost. That's why I still proclaim that anybody that had an NES around here had parents who were high-ranking members of the Communist Party and were actively oppressing the people, and they should be hunted down and flogged with fish. But that aside, Bad Dudes vs. Dragonninja is a gaming experience that amazed me back then. How could it not? It was the first one I played. It was kind of the only one I could play on account of there were so many people around crowding every arcade cabinet. There was one especially that looked interesting. It was about a guy punching a trash can and a fried chicken came out of it, like an entire chicken. I'm very certain that was Final Fight. There was also one or two pinball machines back there, but I never got to actually play them. But I did get to play Bad Dudes vs. Dragonninja. I got to move that arcade stick, press those buttons and pretend I had a clue what was happening. Learning to play that game, realizing that, oh, I press this button and I punch people, I press this one and I jump. I can dodge under the stars they're throwing at me, I can jump up, jump down. I have special moves, special attacks. That was an experience that blew my mind. Fighting a first boss, that fat guy that spewed fire. Again, amazing experience. Getting to the second level and fighting on the back of a truck, which for some reason I remember it as being a bit more isometric, or at least more of a 2-point perspective thing. It's actually flat. It's always been flat, but I remember it being different. And also remember the game being so much fun. I mean, you were fighting ninjas. And this was a time when American Ninja was all the rage in my neighborhood, in the country even. On account of that's generally what we were watching back then, since we didn't have a lot of video players or a lot of video cassettes. TVs were, television channels. There was one. It wasn't completely communist anymore, but still it was just one, so we enjoyed gathering around the video player with the neighbors and watching that classic Hollywood masterpiece, American Ninja. Replaying Bad Dudes vs. Dragonninja years, many years later, in the NES version, I still thought of it as a good game. It was a game where I played a bad dude punching ninjas. Replaying it now, especially replaying the arcade version now, it's not really all that great. You've got very limited abilities as a character. You basically just have one move. You punch people and maybe you jump and kick them, and that's it. The enemies just come right at you. They don't really do much unless they throw stars. In the arcade version, you are guaranteed to die non-stop on account of you die really fast, and you are encouraged to spend money to come back to life, while in the NES version, it's a lot easier. And yet it's still a game that I love, because I have so many fond memories of it. But I wouldn't say it's good. Not compared to so many other games of that genre that have come out over the years and were available even back then in some way. Though it is still better than the first game I actually bought for a home console, Urban Champion. I played that game for quite a while. Not even then that I think it was good, because I had the comparison factor of Bad Dudes vs Dragonninja to set against it. But what if I didn't have that standard? Would I have thought that a game like Urban Champion was good? Well, compared to the Atari games I had up until then, it's still kind of debatable. I mean, most of them were horrible, apart from River Raid. But I would say that no one that played Urban Champion would say that it was a good game. Bad Dudes vs Dragonninja at least gave you exhilaration, it gave you diversity of locations. It gave you the sense that you were a bad dude fighting ninjas to save the president. Urban Champion did nothing. So even though mechanically, Bad Dudes, not a great game, thematically, stylistically, it was memorable. It was endearing. It was something that could stick with you for years, though it still wasn't good enough to get a revival. So in this case, no, the old game was not good, even though it was the first one I played it and I can fully admit that I loved it. Still wouldn't say it's actually good, it's fine, it's okay. It's kinda shallow, it's like the Skyrim of side-scrolling beat-em-ups. We could also talk a bit about Skyrim as well. As you may have probably noticed, it's not the first game I played or among the first ones I played. It is, however, one of the first games that many other people have played. It's one of the more influential games that they have played, that has shaped their knowledge of video games and their expectations for them. And Skyrim is, for the most part, a crock of shit, made by people who thought that emulating the control method of an Apple iPod in a game was something good, instead of, coming up with a method of control that actually properly used a game controller to its maximum potential, or at least, a mouse, like Morrowind did. But to talk about how crappy Skyrim is, we have to first talk about the rest of the Elder Scrolls series, which in my case, the first one I played was Morrowind. Is it better because it's older? No, it's not better because it's older, it's better because it's better in some aspects. It's better in the world, it's better in the storytelling, it's better in the characters, it's much, much better in the dialogue. Much better in the lore even, it's more palpable there. It's not better in the way the NPCs react to you, in the sense that they don't really do that. They stand in the middle of the night wandering around Balmoral with a torch in their hands, even when it's raining. They're idiots. It's not better in terms of combat. You don't really have good combat in the Elder Scrolls series. Skyrim is a bit better in that sense, but for the most part, no. Skyrim does, however, have the advantage in terms of graphical fidelity. It's entirely gray, and kind of it being in the winter and there being no color in the winter. There could be, but there isn't. And it's a lot easier to play. It's more accessible than Morrowind was. In Morrowind, you could absolutely get murderized by 2 rats in the first quest you have for the Warriors Guild. In Skyrim, pretty much little chances of you ever being in any actual danger or kind of things tend to not really vary that much. It doesn't have the same amount of level of scaling that Oblivion had. I'm not gonna get into Oblivion itself, and I only played a few hours of it and I thought it was a complete disaster and an utterly horrid game. Mostly on account of its interface. It was just so dumb, so apocalyptically awful that the rest of the game didn't matter. It was like trying to play a game with your hands tied behind your back while jumping on one foot and singing Yankee Doodle Dandy Went to Town. But at least, from what I understand, Oblivion still gave you more freedom than Skyrim. You still had the ability to create your own spells. You still had the ability to fly, I think. Not entirely sure. And in Skyrim, you gave up those abilities for a more directed game experience, for a more, I wouldn't say cinematic, but a more handheld, more linear, more scripted type of experience, which in itself can be an okay thing. The Witcher 3, that's a linear scripted experience where you are taken by the hand and led through a certain series of events. And it's a good story, it's a very nice experience. Skyrim isn't. It is dreadful compared to Morrowind. Yes, even that was a bit more of a linear experience, but it still had some more freedom in terms of how you handle things, and the linear parts, they weren't dreadful. The story was actually good. Well, not great, but it still was good. It was interesting. And that too was completely different to what we got before with Daggerfall, which was even more of an open experience. Even less story-tied elements where you are free to act of your own volition. Sure, the game had kind of janky controls and would crash non-stop and was about as repetitive as you could get, but still, even though it was repetitive, it had a lot of things to repeat. A lot of different things that repeated. Where in the end you sort of got the impression that there was more diverse content and more to do in it, more original stuff to do in it, than you had in Morrowind or Skyrim or Oblivion. Does that make Daggerfall the best of them? Does that make the old game better than the new ones? Again, in some aspects, yes. Overall, I think Morrowind nailed it the best. And while we're at this, let's bring in the sort of founder of this genre, of the immersive first-person RPG, Ultima Underworld. Is Ultima Underworld a good game, or is it just nostalgia? Let's take it in terms of playability. All games tend to be horrible at playability. The Ultima games especially tend to be horrid at playability. In Ultima Underworld you do not have mouse look, but you do move with the WASD keys and X for backwards. That's about as standard as you can get. You jump with the J key, that's again simple. You have mouse aiming for all your attacks and skills. You interact with the world not with complicated keyboard shortcuts, but by pointing at objects and clicking on them. Sure, you first have to click on the action you want to use, whether it is to pick up, to utilize, to open, or to talk to something. So it's not a contextual simple thing, but compared to other games that came out after it, it's still quite playable. How is it in terms of story? Quite simple, and honestly, story wasn't the main focus of it. And the aspect of story, yeah, even Skyrim has sort of the edge on it. How is it in terms of combat? It's at the same level as Skyrim. No kidding, they kinda have the same idea. You have heavy attacks, light attacks, you can swing your swords and axes, you can throw spells. Sure, you can't dual wield them, you actually have to click on the spell to use it, which in this world makes magic harder to use and more valuable, rarer. That's why not everyone is a wizard. What about characters? They're not overly complex, I mean they're kind of simplistic in the way that you talk to them, but in terms of being simulated, in terms of them actually having a point to their lives, they're a step over Morrowind. They'll at least move about a bit more than the ones in Balmoral. But in terms of world design, it absolutely trumps all the rest of them. Though to be fair, this is mostly because Ultima Underworld is a dungeon simulator and not a dungeon crawler or an open world game. And a kind of open world games tend to be just flat places with some trees on them and a couple of characters, and the pretense that you are free to do anything you want. In this world, you were actually free to do anything you wanted, and the world reacted to you. You had very good integration with your actions in the world. It was a pioneering game in terms of immersion in first person. Does that make it better than anything that came after it? Well, that's actually kind of hard to say. Yes, in some terms it is absolutely better than anything that Elder Scrolls ever came up with, but it is a bit parallel to them in some ways. It's incomparable. It focuses on different things and it does them very well, or at least very well for that time. And as a whole, it is a very cohesive, very well made game that has a point to it. Okay, so that got things a bit confused. Let's switch to something else. Master of Magic. Is it better than every other 4X fantasy game ever made? No. And honestly, that's mostly because Age of Wonders 3 came along. But for many years, it was the golden standard. It was a game that brought you the most exhilaration, the most joy. And it did that by being an unbalanced, buggy mess, where you had a spell called Crack Skull that killed anything, as long as it wasn't flying. And it killed things in such a way that you couldn't bring them back to life. You had a resurrection spell for your heroes, well, tough luck. They're technically not dead, they're in the center of the earth, slowly rotting away, being eaten alive by maggots or something. But it is still a great game. Absolutely, it is still a great game. Super Mario Bros., from which I cannot actually show footage on account of Nintendo being assholes, is it better than the games we have today? Well, compared to the current Mario games, you gotta say no. On account of Nintendo has been refining this formula for 30 years. They've been constantly improving it. So it makes sense that the last Mario game that has an absolutely superb theme song, my god, that melody is amazing, it makes sense that it is better than its predecessor. And yet, the first Super Mario Bros. Game is still a superb video game. It is an amazing game. It is simplistic and yet quite enjoyable. It is a great game. It's downright a masterpiece, to which some people will ascribe the first story in a video game, saving the princess. That was the first story ever put into a video game, And Mario was, of course, the first video game character, and that's something that people that play it at first will say. They will assign to the game properties that do not belong to it. They will uplift it to the rank of legend, to beyond the bounds of mortality, and that's when nostalgia really kicks in. When you get into revisionist history territory, that's when things really start becoming muddled and kinda horrible. That's when you start misremembering things. That's when you start to think, oh yeah, all games back then were great, weren't they? All games were absolutely amazing. I mean, Ghosts and Goblins was the dark souls of its time. It was a horrible game. Ghosts and Goblins was a dreadfully designed game made specifically to kill you, to punish you at every point you would... Okay, so yeah, in some terms it is kind of like Dark Souls, but it was simply badly made in many aspects. Enemy placement, enemy spawn, weapons, most of them were just horrible. There was only one actually worth a damn, and the rest were just traps. In the idea that no, not all games are actually good, I'd also mention pretty much every JRPG made, at least the old ones, that were just a repetitive grind with no substance to it, all involving a story about a crystal. Objectively, they weren't good games, but they were played by kids. Kids with no concept of what a good game would be, and they enjoyed it, much like I enjoyed Bad Dudes vs. Dragonninja. And some of them never grew up, and still think those games are good, and still think JRPG combat is acceptable today, that it's not one of the worst combat modes ever made. And we can thank those people for decades of stagnation in combat design too. Though that's not really fair, it's the game developers' fault for not innovating at all and just resting on their laurels. So in the end, because I sort of veered off track and forgot what the show was about, are all the games better? Or is it just nostalgia? Well, you just have to take it one game at a time. Or we could just go with the fact that Star Control 2 is 25 years old and it's better than most games ever made. What you can say, however, is that people were trying more back then. They didn't have the recipe for what sells and then just made more of that. They innovated, they created new genres, they brought us new experiences. And by new experience, I don't just mean new walking simulators that explore what the artists had for lunch in a very, very postmodernist approach to psychologically inferring that everybody's actually secretly a hamster. They actually made games and made them interesting, put thought in them, put passion in them. They didn't just go with the idea, oh, we've got them already, they're entrenched, they've been indoctrinated since the first one, there is no point in trying, we'll sell anyway. They're not Electronic Arts, is what I'm saying. Heck, even Electronic Arts back then wasn't Electronic Arts. They still had to fight to get an audience, they still had to try. Now they don't. Now they just have to market it, and they do have quite a lot of money for the marketing. Whereas, back then, a good game would often sell itself. Heck, good games even today sell themselves. But there tend to be very, very loud voices saying that the games that are better marketed are the best. Those voices being the marketers themselves. So what I'm getting at in the conclusion to this mishmash of bad ideas is that games today can be better. A lot of them aren't. Whereas games back then weren't always good, but a lot of them were, or at least they were better than what came before them. They were braver, they looked better, they brought us new dimensions and new dreams, and no loot boxes whatsoever. So in the end, please tell me in the comments what game you have fond memories of, but you know in your heart of hearts that truly it was awful. It's probably gonna be Pokemon. Goodbye.